Good evening. Good evening. I'm going to talk today about returning the so-called Elgin marbles to their rightful home on the Parthenon. Actually, I think Elgin marbles is an awful term. I would call them the Parthenon sculptures. Now, it has been established, I think, beyond any reasonable doubt, that they should go back. They were taken illegally, smashed off the Parthenon itself. There's no permission given for that. And they were then sold rather surreptitiously by this so-called ambassador to the British government, who then sold them on to the British Museum. Even that has been proven to have been a possibly illegal transaction. Now, people like Clinton of America, Kinnock of England, and opinion polls in England have clearly shown that these marbles should be returned morally, legally, culturally, and intellectually. They should go back to their rightful home. They represent the cradle of civilization. What I'm going to do is approach the subject in a slightly oblique fashion, but by the end things will be very clear. It may be unfortunate in certain circles, but I can't help that, because I like, as you know, getting to the marrow, right through the bone of a subject. I think it's better to bite the bullet if you're going to have a solution than skirt around the issue with public relations. You know, all that glisters is not gold, often have ye heard that told. Now, we know that the human being is a bit of a nasty biped, I'm afraid, in some respects. All sorts of nasty, dark traits lurk in his brain: cowardice, greed, sheer barbarity. Let's look at what the Athenians did to Milos. Let's look at what the Eastern Roman Empire did to the Bulgars. It blinded them. Let's look at the murder of Irish priests, women, and children by the English forces of Cromwell. Let's look at the genocide of Armenians and Greeks by the Ottomans. Let's look at the genocide of the Amerindians and the My Lai massacre by Americans. Let's look at the shooting of unarmed Polish prisoners by the Soviet Union. The genocide of Gypsies and Hebrews by the Germans. I'm reading this little bit. The bombing of Dresden, the US by day, Britain by night. The genocide of the Serbs in the Second World War by the Croatians. Genocide of Cambodians by Cambodians, with a bit of help from our friend Henry Kissinger. The butchering of Palestinians at Shabra and Shatia rather, by the Israelis and their friends. Man can be quite a brutal creature. However civilized a species we are, it seems that no amount of technological gadgetry or fashionable clothes can change that fact. In fact, sometimes they accentuate it. Now, trained diplomats hate that sort of thing, but I'm afraid diplomats haven't always been that great. Today they have very little power. They're essentially cocktail party functionaries, but once upon a time they had real power. One of these people who had a lot of power was Mr. Bruce, otherwise known as the 7th and 11th Earl of Elgin and Kincardine, respectively, who, as you probably know, was the ambassador to the Sublime Porte, the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. Now, we know that he paid a bribe and he smashed these beautiful sculptures off the Parthenon, took them back to England, sold them, and all the rest of it. He was a bit of a diplomatic wide boy, I have to say. A bit of a rum character, a traitor to the Scots, although he was apparently a Scotsman. Only, a few years after, 50 odd years after the 1745 Scottish Rebellion, there's this Scotsman working for the British Empire and being more imperial than anybody. I mean, Robert the Bruce, his namesake, must be spinning in his grave. Now, why doesn't Britain give these beautiful sculptures back? Well, first, Britain has no culture or monuments that are even incipiently comparable to these beautiful sculptures. And I'm talking about an English mentality here. Now, the sculptures apart, British dependent territories such as the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Gibraltar, Crown dependencies such as Jersey and the Isle of Man are havens for money launderers. Why do I say this? Because the only difference between that and hanging onto the Elgin marbles is that it's handling stolen goods. Stolen money ends up in these places controlled by the British. And the British also hang on to stolen goods in the British Museum. Now, the British Museum should be renamed the British Colonial Museum, because most of the stuff was procured from our colonies. Some of the stuff was procured is a lovely word to use, nice and neutral, isn't it? Was procured outside the British Empire during periods of chaos. Now, Greece was in a funny situation, of course, at the beginning of the 19th century, as we know, with the Ottoman Empire corrupt and dying, even with the so-called Tanzimat measures, etc., which, well, people were talking about introducing them. They had been introduced in some places. There was huge corruption and bakshish. So Britain managed to get various things. Now, the British Empire has now transmogrified, of course, into a series of strong points which the Americans asked us to keep. Diego Garcia is one. The Falkland Islands or Malvinas Islands is another. Cyprus and Gibraltar are others. Now, Diego Garcia was rented to the Americans, and the British, therefore, on US orders, kicked out the original brown-skinned inhabitants and gassed their animals and sent them away. Whereas the British actually sailed all the way down to the Malvinas Falkland Islands to rescue the same number of white-skinned inhabitants. Well, pity that. But it's all about post-imperial rigor mortis. Do you think that there's a certain insecurity behind this? Because Britain is no longer a great power and still boxes above its weight, because it indulges in slipstream diplomacy, as Edward Heath said, because it has no foreign policy, as de Gaulle said, because British foreign policy, at least as regards security, is American foreign policy. Do you think that that's one reason why Britain likes to hang on to these beautiful sculptures, because it shows a Churchillian pluck that we can hang on to these things because we're the British Empire and they're in the British Museum? Never mind the fact that they should be on the Parthenon. In other words, it's good for Britain's image to be obstinate, apparently. Now, there's a kind of feeling in some quarters in Greece that Britain has always been nice to Greece. I'm afraid the opposite is true. Greece became independent despite Britain, not because of it. It was Russia that forced the British to jump into the game. And I can give another talk about that later, but it's irrevocably proven that the Protocol of 1826 and the Russians came in and forced the British to do something. Then there's a statement in 1841 by the British minister which said that Greece must be British, and since she cannot be Russian, she must be British, or something to that end. And then in 1850 there's the Don Pacifico affair, when the British sent down gunships because the Greeks hadn't paid enough to a Gibraltarian Jewish chap because his house was trashed. And then, of course, there's a Crimean War when Britain and the French poodles then actually blockaded Greece because they didn't want Greece to help the Russians. And then there's the First World War, when Britain supported an illegal government of Venizelos to bring Greece into the First World War, which caused all kinds of problems for Greece later on, as we know, because Venizelos didn't want Greece to be neutral. Venizelos, with his grand ideas to expand too far, a bridge too far, very unrealistic, against the advice, incidentally, of people like Metaxas at the time. And then there's the Greek Civil War after the last war, which was absolutely dreadful. I'm afraid the British role in that was unfortunate. And then there's Cyprus. Now, that's a whole story which I'll talk about later, but Britain, I'm afraid, has not been nice to Greece. That's why it stresses cultural relations. Let me give you a statement, 1975, by the British Foreign Office. We should also recognise that in the final analysis, Turkey must be regarded as more important to Western strategic interests than Greece, and that, if risks must be run, they should be risks of further straining Greek rather than Turkish relations with the West. Doesn't that say it all? Greece is simply, psychologically, still part of the Anglo-Saxon Empire. Let's begin to conclude. We're talking about cultural relations. Well, Britain's cultural relations these days obviously do not involve being nice about the Parthenon sculptures. What do? We promote LGBT. What is LGBT? Well, now I have to read, because I've never understood LGBT, because I'm not an LGBT type. Here we are. UK. It's gay, bisexual, and transgender people and their rights. LGBT. Well, what we do is promote that abroad as part of our cultural relations. Very different from giving back the marbles, which would be the best cultural relations. Now, the British ambassador in Warsaw actually hoisted a rainbow flag outside the British embassy, and the Polish government complained about this. And what did the Foreign Office reply? And now I'm reading here, so you'll have to bear with me a moment. Oh yes, it has a policy, the British government has a policy of promoting LGBT rights abroad. Well, my reaction to that is, what about promoting heterosexual rights as well? I think it's not being very nice to heterosexuals. Well, it's a shame, I think, that British diplomatic aestheticism and cultural relations seem to concentrate on the well-known English sphere of natural sex rather than on the beauty of ancient sculptures waiting to be returned to their rightful home. Why doesn't David Landsman, the British ambassador in Athens, emulate his homologue, Todd, who was the British ambassador in Warsaw, and put up a rainbow flag outside the embassy? Does he agree that Britain should promote LGBT in Greece as well? Or perhaps there are subtler ways of promoting LGBT in Greece through articles placed with the British Embassy's list of compliant and sycophantic Greek journalists. At any rate, perhaps the Greek government should show some real gumption and initiate a proper campaign to get the plunderers to return the goods. It could begin by raising a flag, its own flag, not a rainbow flag, but a flag with blood dripping off one of the best stolen statues superimposed onto the Parthenon. It's time Britain came clean on the Parthenon and made up for all the unprovoked damage it has done to Greece. Now, let's stop and think. Cultural relations are often a cover for political relations. But in this case, promoting cultural relations like LGBT and all that is simply, it's cosmetic. It doesn't get to the core of true cultural relations. I think that most thinking people in the world think that the Parthenon, which represents the civilization of what we call the West, should be restored to its former glory. And I think that Britain will gain itself international prestige if it returns those marbles to the Greeks. It will also help the Greeks. It will help relations between states in general. Now, I'm sorry if I've sounded rather serious about this subject, and you probably noticed that I was reading occasionally because I was really summarizing an article I wrote called Post-imperial Rigor Mortis and Cultural Hooliganism, the Brutish Connexion, which you can also read on my blog site in any case, and I think on my Facebook. But, I don't want to harm anybody, hurt anybody, criticize anybody unduly, but I do want to say that really, Britain, come clean. Divest yourself of these stolen goods and put them in their rightful place. Otherwise, it's just a continuing case of Hooliganism, which I mention in this book, one of my books here on Cyprus, the word Hooliganism. Probably in this one as well. Here, another one. Probably in this one and a few others. Anyhow, look, I'm going to stop now, and I know that my delivery may have been slightly promiscuous. I'm not sure about the quality of this video, but we'll see in a minute. But I do suggest that we really think of how can we improve true relations between those two great countries, Britain and Greece. Just give back the marbles, relax. Well, good night, and I wish you a good time until my next talk. Bye-bye.